This video is sponsored by Only Crits. We just started a new video series on this channel where we're going to talk about campaign structures and the many ways you can run your D&D campaign. And the majority of our examples are going to be taken from TV shows and comics, since those offer a really helpful format that we can borrow for our own ongoing stories. And this is something I love to do. I love to see what lessons we can apply from movies and TV to our own games. Years ago, I made a video all about why it's good to steal things from popular media and put them in our games. And since then, I've made a bunch of videos about the lessons we can steal from movies or TV shows. I just made one about the first D&D episode of Community, which was doing great numbers before it got copyright claimed, and I'm probably going to have to re-edit it and re-upload it. Please watch it again when it comes out. But I'm about to launch a year-long series all about structuring our campaigns, and we're going to use a ton of examples from popular media. And so I thought now would be the perfect time to take you through the books and movies and TV shows and comics that are part of my personal Appendix N. If you're not familiar with the term, Appendix N was a section in the back of the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide full of inspirational and educational reading. It's where Gary Gygax and the rest of the D&D team included a list of authors they were big fans of and whose work influenced early D&D. People like Edgar Rice Burroughs, Robert E. Howard, Fritz Leiber, Michael Moorpark, Jack Vance, and so many more. And in the 2014 Player's Handbook, we got Appendix E, which includes all the authors from the original Appendix N, plus some new ones like Piers Anthony, Terry Brooks, Terry Pratchett, Stephen King, Scott Lynch, Ursula Le Guin, and so many more. And at some point, I do plan to go through a lot of these books on these lists that I haven't read, and check them out and talk about them on the channel, and invite you to read them along with me. We'll do a whole Appendix N book club. But that's not what we're doing today. No, today I'm just sharing the fictional works that have inspired me already, and continue to inspire me when I'm creating D&D adventures and campaigns. This isn't all the art I like. There are plenty of great pieces of art that inspire me as a creator and as a writer, but that won't appear in this video. Like, I love The Matrix, and I think there are a ton of lessons we can learn from it as writers. But unless I wind up playing or running a Matrix-style sci-fi campaign at some point, I don't typically think about The Matrix when I'm running my games. That's pretty much the only criteria for the art that I'm going to talk about today. And I'm also sure that I'll forget some, and a week from now I'll go, oh my gosh, I can't believe I didn't mention this book or movie or whatever. I can't believe I didn't mention The Page Master. I don't know. So maybe I'll put those in a pinned comment below. And I encourage you to go through this exercise as well. Think about the art that inspires you and drop it in the comments. And then if you're looking for recommendations for great works of art that can inspire your own D&D games, hopefully the comment section can act as a reference for a ton of great options. Especially because, for some reason, there's no version of the Appendix N in the new core rulebooks for D&D 5.5, which just seems so strange to me. Like, I understand that this list wasn't in any other versions of the game besides AD&D and 5th edition, but if you want 2024 to be the definitive edition of the game, I don't know, I would have made some room for one more page where you can discuss a list of books. But, of course that's important to me. I'm literally doing a whole video series about the art that influences my games, so clearly putting in a list of art that influences our games is something that I'm very passionate about. But I'm also right, there should have been a list of inspirational reading in the new Player's Handbook. I'm right about that. So, I guess once again, a D&D YouTuber will have to pick up the slack. Before we continue, I want to give a huge shout out to today's sponsor, Only Crits, and their new Kickstarter for Class Dice, which just launched today. Only Crits is a fantastic company. I've worked with them for years now, and they make some truly beautiful dice sets. And as of 5 a.m. today, they're launching a new Kickstarter campaign where they're offering pastel, sharp-edged, class-specific dice sets. Right now, they're offering 3 sets, the Fighter, the Wizard, and the Rogue, but through their stretch goals, they're hoping to unlock dice sets for all 12 of the core classes from the Player's Handbook. These designs are truly beautiful, and with this campaign, they're also offering the option for ordering 11-piece dice sets, with 2d20s and 4d6s, although you could just get the standard 7-piece dice set if that's what you prefer. This is the third Only Crits Kickstarter, and their first 2 were extremely successful. Their last Kickstarter was funded in only 32 minutes, all the early bird rewards were scooped up on the first day, and they had a very smooth delivery for the final product. And speaking of early bird rewards, the campaign launched the same moment this video went live, so if you're one of the first 250 backers on the Kickstarter, you'll receive a free 5e class adventure, custom made for this Kickstarter. So act right now if you want to get your hands on this reward. And if you want to get your hands on any of these dice, please visit the Kickstarter at the link in the description so you can get your very own set of class dice. Thank you so much to Only Crits for sponsoring this video. First, we're going to talk about books. And I guess I'll start by listing off a few major names that will not appear on my list because I haven't read them yet. And I know some of these are going to make some of you declare fake nerd, even though that's not a thing. And I'd also like to think the rest of this channel's output has demonstrated that I am very much a nerd. But still, there are some potentially offensive omissions here. For example, probably the most influential writer in the entire fantasy genre is J.R.R. Tolkien. The Lord of the Rings is a masterpiece. Or so I'm told. Because I've never actually read The Lord of the Rings. I know, I know, scandal. And also, that's not entirely accurate to say. My dad read The Hobbit to me and my sister when we were kids. I also discussed this in my Super Geek Academy video that also released today, but we had a version that used stills from the animated film as basically picture book illustrations, so even though I've never seen that movie, for a long time those designs were still the default images in my heads for hobbits and dwarves and wizards and goblins and golems. And I've read The Hobbit again as an adult, although it's been many, many years. And when I was maybe in 4th or 5th grade, I read The Fellowship of the Ring and wrote a book report on it. I liked that one. And I tried to read the whole trilogy before the movie trilogy finished. I remember reading The Two Towers before the film came out, and I got about halfway through Return of the King as well. I remember I brought my copy with me to Skywalker Ranch because, yeah, I got to visit Skywalker Ranch when I was 15. It was completely random, and looking back, I probably wasn't allowed to be there. But anyway, I never finished Return of the King. So I've read a lot of The Lord of the Rings, but I haven't read the whole thing, and it's been many years since I've tried. It's one of those series that I definitely want to come back to once I've got some more time, because I'm sure I'll enjoy the books a lot more now, or at the very least, I'll be able to appreciate them better. I just want to take the time to really give them the time they deserve. And speaking of authors who I want to take a little time to read, I read very little Terry Pratchett, just a couple of Discworld books, and at some point I do really want to binge through that whole series. Same goes for Ursula Le Guin. I've heard nothing but great things about her, and I've never read any of her work. And of course, there's the Great White Whale of modern fantasy. I haven't read anything by Brandon Sanderson. I have a few of his books, but he's definitely an author that I'm very excited to dig into when I've got a little bit less on my plate to distract me. There's also the Game of Thrones books and the Witcher books. Now, I've read a little bit of both of those, but again, those are series that I want to finish at some point. Okay, so what have I read? What fantasy books inspire my fantasy games? Well, one of the big ones is The Kingkiller Chronicles, The Name of the Wind, and The Wise Man's Fear. I really love the way Patrick Rothfuss makes sense of magic, and in fact, his books have heavily influenced the way I visualize spell slots in D&D, even though that's not really how his magic system works. But I've made a video about that in the early days of my channel. Another modern fantasy author I really like is Scott Lynch. I've only read Lies of Locke Lamora. I haven't read the rest of the Gentleman Bastards series, but I love that first book. I've gleefully stolen the idea of humans living in a city built around the ruins of some non-human civilization with structures made of mysterious materials. I love the way magic is understood by the civilians. I love what we know about the religion of the world. And quite frankly, I love all the horrible people we meet in the criminal underground of a fantasy world. It's a great book with some truly despicable villains in it. I've read one book so far of the Conan the Barbarian short stories, and I think going back and reading those should be essential for anyone running old school games like Shadowdark, because those games don't just have to be constant grim darkness, you can also lean into the pulp and have enormous fun with that. I've read the original Dragonlance trilogy and liked it a whole lot. I know it's hardly an original observation, but when you're running a D&D game, it can be really helpful to read official D&D novels and see how some of these concepts can be adapted from simple rules into fiction. If you can visualize what it feels like to see a spell being cast or stand in the presence of a dragon, and those things explicitly follow the rules of the official D&D game, I think that's a huge help when you're a player trying to imagine living in this world, or a game master trying to figure out how to describe the experiences of the player characters. Now, I've mentioned on this channel before that I'm a big fan of the adventure Curse of Strahd. However, I'm not a big fan of horror movies, so I was coming to that campaign without a lot of that typical horror perspective. And I definitely wanted to dig into what makes vampires so frightening, and why they've persisted as a concept for so long. So I read the original Dracula. And you know what? It's a really solid book. It's actually excellent. I don't know if it made me better as a GM of horror, but if you're running a vampire campaign, it's really valuable to go back to the original, not just because it's fun to find ways to incorporate it into your campaign, but also just because it holds the hell up. Sometimes I'm influenced by Harry Potter, just like any other millennial. A lot of my concepts for what makes for good uses of magic in a fantasy world are influenced by this book series, sometimes in contrast to the series, but other times, I think the books do actually have some good, or at least interesting, examples of how magic can be integrated into a high magic world. Obviously, that is a much harder book series to recommend these days, since unlike so many other problematic creators, she's a leading voice in a campaign to further demonize and terrorize all transgender people around the world, and she's actively influencing UK politics to amplify transphobic rhetoric and discrimination, and it's utterly despicable. Which is why I'm also very happy to recommend the Percy Jackson books by Rick Riordan. Not only are they really fun books that are also aren't so thick that they could stop a bullet, but they also have a lot of fun interpreting mythological stories and figures into the modern world, and that's the kind of thing I really love. In a way, these books tackle Greek myths the same way I tackle a lot of my favorite pop culture. I steal characters and concepts very liberally, reskin them, and drop them into my game, and then dare my players to make the connection. And speaking of the movies and TV shows I steal from, let's talk about those. First of all, when talking about fantasy and pitching D&D to modern audiences, The Lord of the Rings films are a huge influence, and in fact they were a major inspiration in my first terrible campaign. I still go back to those movies all the time, the theatrical versions of course, and I can find all sorts of characters or archetypes or moments or environments to rip off from my campaigns. Plus, I just generally love the tone of those films, they're so well done. And when discussing modern fantasy, Game of Thrones is the other huge elephant in the room. I've already mentioned my issues with the end of that show in literally every video I've put out this year, so I'll just say, goddamn, there's a lot of great stuff in the first half of that show, and I honestly don't think we appreciate enough just how much that show gave us a vocabulary to share our nerdy interests with people who don't think of themselves as nerds. Pretty much everybody watched Game of Thrones, so now they have a shorthand you can use to connect with them about some fantastical concepts, or even just when trying to communicate the tone of a D&D world and what it's like for the everyday people who aren't wizards or rangers or bards. Plus, a lot of us learned a lot more about medieval fantasy worlds from that show. Like now a lot more of us know what a queen regent is. We know if someone says, "My little birds told me a secret," we know we're dealing with a spy master. It's a pretty helpful show for communicating with the normies. Switching gears a bit to something much more optimistic, I'm a huge fan of Star Wars. I mean, at least half of all Star Wars is bad, but I love Star Wars as a concept. And there's the obvious stuff, like how the original trilogy gave so many of us the language to understand the hero's journey and how to do pulp adventure in the middle of a wartime setting, because I don't think we give that franchise enough credit for how they did that. But I also think we can learn a lot from the way Luke's backstory becomes interconnected into the evil empire. I think the wrong lesson is that all the players should be the most important people in the world, and Star Wars learned that lesson hard in the wrong way. But the correct lesson would be that you should make sure that whatever the players are going through feels personal to them. They need to be personally connected to the adventure, and The Empire Strikes Back does that masterfully. Editing Mike here, and I realize as I'm working on this section of the video that if you're looking for a Star Wars movie where the main character is not the most important person in the universe, but the story still feels particularly relevant to that character and they're still emotionally involved in it, and it feels personal to them, that's The Last Jedi. That's what that movie's about. I don't think it's a perfect movie, but I do think everything with Rey and Kylo and Luke and Snoke is really, really excellent. And it really does kind of solve that problem that I think a lot of Star Wars movies and a lot of franchises in general struggle with, which is how do you make sure that the story feels personal and that the main character is really plugged into the story and the quest, but that they're also not this prophesied main character, most important person in the universe. It's a real shame that some whiny crybabies online didn't like how the movie made them feel, and they threw such a bad tantrum that it fucked up all movies across the board for everybody. But if you're looking for how to do this trope really well, I think The Last Jedi does it really excellently, and that's maybe something that I am going to take a lot of inspiration from when trying to solve that problem for my own games. Alright, back to the main video. Indiana Jones and the Mummy are also fantastic examples of another whole genre of my favorite kinds of fiction, stories where the folklore and myths of human history turn out to be completely true. And even though that's more relevant to modern urban fantasy rather than D&D, I will say those franchises still offer great examples of how to make your players care about the worlds you invented. At some point, I've got to break down The Last Crusade and demonstrate how you could steal that format for an adventure that would guide your players through the fictional history of your world and make them really care about your setting. Also, like so many other millennials, I was heavily influenced by Disney animated movies, but if I'm honest, that is such a deep well that we just don't have time to get into it today. Except to say that Treasure Planet still rules and you should go rewatch it and steal as much from it as you can, because it has a lot to offer. In the realm of TV shows, I've made no secret of how I've been influenced by Lost and Avatar: The Last Airbender. Both of those shows have series-long objectives and take different approaches to accomplish them, but are also both really excellent works of epic fantasy. I also like Legend of Korra a lot. It's not as good as The Last Airbender, but it's still great. And the villains are exceptional on that show. The Doctor Who revival also introduces a new storyline each season that plays out in the background, and that's honestly a really helpful way to handle serialization in a mostly episodic campaign. I also grew up on superhero cartoons like the DC animated universe, and so many others. And while these shows probably heavily influenced my sense of pacing and my sense of humor, I honestly think so many of my villains are designed in the shadow of some of those villains. And then of course there's the MCU. Honestly, one of my favorite parts of creating a D&D adventure is to dig into some piece of the MCU that was either forgotten or unfairly maligned and steal it for my games. Everyone will notice if you drop Thanos into your D&D campaign, but in my experience, nobody notices if you instead drop in a reskinned version of a less memorable villain like Emil Blonsky or Malekith or Ronan the Accuser or Dreykov from Black Widow. And honestly, a lot of these villains are actually perfectly suited for a D&D campaign. They may not all be great movie villains, but they're perfectly solid RPG villains. Of course, these characters all originated in the pages of comics, but there are other comics I'm particularly inspired by. I'm a big fan of Scott Snyder's Batman run, particularly Black Mirror and Court of Owls, because Snyder had a really fantastic approach to designing his villains and his adventures, with a specific goal of turning his heroes' strengths into weaknesses. The Court of Owls exists to challenge one of Batman's greatest assets, his knowledge of Gotham, and Black Mirror specifically seeks to create a rogues gallery for Dick Grayson that really speaks to what made him different from Bruce Wayne in his tenure as Batman. Snyder also did some great stuff with the Joker, especially stuff that seems like things I would hate on paper, like Death of the Family. That story should be absolutely terrible, but it actually rules. Speaking of things that should have been terrible, Spider-Man Brand New Day came after one of the worst Spider-Man comics ever, and yet it did a fantastic job of balancing all these different subplots running through the book at once. And it was especially impressive because it was written by a team of writers working together to put up a bunch of Spider-Man comics that would all serve to tell one story together like a TV show. And I think they did an amazing job, even though some of those stories were not created equal. Like, Bob Gale co-wrote Back to the Future and I Want to Hold Your Hand, so he's clearly an incredibly gifted writer, but holy crap, I could not stand his Spider-Man comics. Thankfully, he didn't stick around as part of that brain trust for long. And the last comic book series I want to talk about today is Hellboy. I'll have to admit that I haven't read everything in Hellboy's universe. I haven't even finished his own story. I fell off that book around the time I fell off of comics in general. But I absolutely love the way Hellboy comics craft atmosphere to create these really frightening scenarios, and yet also still make it believable that someone could just beat the shit out of the monsters in question. And since that's basically the exact format of a D&D adventure, I've gotten a lot of inspiration from these comics. Lastly, I want to talk about video games. Now, I have to admit that I was never big on video games as a kid. My mother thought they rotted your brain, but if I'm honest, I'm kind of glad in retrospect that I never got hooked on video games because they were just so expensive. But I got a bit into video games during the 2020 lockdown, and I've got a bunch more games I want to play. And so here are just a few that I'm a big fan of and that really inspire me when I run my games. I'm going to give an honorable mention to The Witcher 3, even though I've barely played any of it, because I know I'm going to get so into it once I get the chance to sit down with it. But I love the job board format of games, so I've already gotten some inspiration from that game, even though I've only been to the first town. But I know it has a whole open world approach, and I haven't really sampled that yet. But I do love the way the open world is handled in the Spider-Man PS4 game. I honestly think that the approach of just having a bunch of different stuff you can do at any given time is really useful for thinking about building your own open world game. Batman Arkham Asylum is a much smaller world, but I love the environmental storytelling in that game and the way they mix up the challenges that they throw at the players, but I'm particularly fond of the way they keep the villain present in the narrative without having the player fight the villain too early. That's a real challenge we have to deal with all the time in our games, and Arkham Asylum solves it in a lot of really clever ways. I think Hades is one of the finest games I've ever played, and while that's not a very long list, I do think it's just a great game. You know how I just made a video about how the cast of Critical Role takes these downtime sessions after each major boss fight? Well, that is literally the format of Hades. Epic fights followed by these downtime sessions that are specifically designed to move the overall story forward. And they still do my favorite trick of including exposition in some of the combat scenes. It handles exposition in a lot of excellent ways, both in combat and in downtime. And finally, the 2017 God of War game does a fantastic job of reinforcing its core themes by having basically every aspect of the story reflect those themes. It's a testament to the power of coming up with a core theme and then emphasizing that theme by reflecting it in all of the other NPCs and side quests. And here's the thing. I'm going to make dedicated videos about basically everything I just talked about. Not so much the books, at least not this year, but we're going to talk about most of these movies and TV shows and comics and video games this year as part of my huge project about structuring your campaign. We're going to do videos about the way these video games present their narratives through their gameplay and world design. We're going to talk about the way those Spider-Man comics weave their storylines in and out of the narrative, and the way Scott Snyder wrote his Batman villains. We're going to talk about Lost and Avatar: The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra and Doctor Who and a whole bunch of superhero cartoons. I don't think I'm going to make videos about the Lord of the Rings movies or the Game of Thrones show, although you never know, things could change. But basically everything else I listed today, yeah, I think I'm going to talk about it. Which means I have to rewatch a lot of TV shows this year. It's honestly been kind of challenging to fit them into my schedule, but it's also really fun to revisit a lot of these shows, some of them for the first time in decades.
But what if people want to watch along with you?
Oh, hi Odwick. Hey, I don't have to call you the algorithm wizard every time you show up, do I?
No, I'm cool.
Okay, cool. So anyway,
I mean, you can still try it out, see how it feels. Odwick the algorithm wizard, it's fun to say. Come on, try it.
No, I'm good.
Your loss. But like I was saying, what if people want to watch all these shows you're going to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if people want, they could pick one of these shows and watch it, and then they'll be able to follow along when I get to that video. But you don't have to. I want to be really clear. I'll make sure that any video I make has enough context so you can follow along if you haven't seen the show. And I'll also flag spoilers so you can avoid them if you still want to watch that show yourself.
But what if people want to watch everything you're talking about this year? Will you give us a full list and what order to watch them in?
I mean, to be honest, I think the TV shows I just named are the most important ones, followed by the comics. I'm going to talk about other TV shows as well, but I don't think all of them need to be rewatched in order to understand the videos. Like, the first show I'm going to talk about is the 2010 Avengers cartoon, but we're just going to talk about the first few episodes. You don't have to watch that whole show to follow along with that video.
But can you please just give us a reading order?
Sure, I guess check out the first season of Doctor Who, and then Avatar: The Last Airbender and The Legend of Korra, and then spend the rest of the year rewatching Lost. Check out the comics too if you want, but if not, it's fine. Like I said, if you don't watch or read any of this stuff, you will still be fine. And also, like I said, I'm not going to discuss those books this year. I just do not have the bandwidth to add any books to my schedule for 2025.
You should make an exception, though.
Oh, I mean, which book do you want to hear me talk about?
For Harry Potter. People would watch a video about the lessons we can learn from Harry Potter.
Yeah, I'm sure they would, but I'm not interested in continuing to platform J.K. Rowling these days.
You know, if you make a Harry Potter video, lots of people would comment about how you shouldn't make that video. It would get lots of engagement.
That's not why I make these videos, Oddbuck. I don't care about the algorithm. I didn't mean that.
No, it's fine. Excuse me.
Oddwick, I'm sorry. I didn't know that was going to upset you. I'm sorry. Sorry. I'm still not making the Harry Potter video. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to be a part of this cool project where I just talk about a whole bunch of TV shows this year, then make sure to subscribe and ring the bell. That is honestly the best way to support this channel. Another fantastic way to help is to support me on Patreon or become a YouTube member. Those both help me keep the lights on. And also, you can still see the community video that's been banned, and you'll see the original version with none of the edits that I'm gonna have to make for it to be visible again. So if that interests you, then join my Patreon or become a YouTube member. Check out the links below to join my Discord server and to sign up for my newsletter so you can catch all of my latest comings and goings. And make sure to watch this video. It's all about the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide, which also has a really interesting list of books it recommends, but the book itself also has some good rules in it. It is a useful book. Those helpful parts are just sort of hidden. Until next time, play fair and have fun.